And I'm Brad McLeod with the Ohio Department of Transportation Chief Legal Section, Workers' Compensation and Safety. Our featured speaker this morning is a statewide and Midwest expert on methamphetamine awareness identification. He is from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation. And before I introduce him, I want to say a special thanks to the partnership that brought this event together. This was the union, this was the Attorney General's Office, BCI, and ODOT working to promote safety in the workplace. This is not a labor issue, it is not a management issue, it is purely and simply a workplace issue. So please make welcome Special Agent from BCI, Dennis Lowe.
Good morning. How are you? All right. I understand that we have people from all over the state of Ohio, so it's a big pleasure and an honor for me to be here this morning. And I want to thank Brad, and I want to thank some folks here from ODOT that helped bring this program to you. Agents in BCI and the unit that I'm assigned to, we travel around the state doing methamphetamine and clandestine drug lab training all over the state of Ohio and throughout the Midwest. And we've certainly been to some of the ODOT facilities around the state, some of the district headquarters and their monthly safety meetings, and I know that we've been to some of the county garages. And quite honestly, it was an undaunting task trying to imagine how we were going to get to every garage and get this message out because it was so extremely important. And I had an opportunity to speak at the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Comp Safety Congress here 3 months ago, and some folks from ODOT were present at the Safety Congress and saw me speak. And after it was over, they approached me about forming a partnership with ODOT and creating a presentation that ODOT could send out to its workforce on this issue. And it's been a great privilege to work with those folks, and I wanted to thank Kate Callahan and Miles, who I think is in the back of the room. Miles, if you're back there, and Mike Tomczak helped put this thing together, and Butch, kind of our little nucleus group that really kind of was at the forefront here. Miles was off on surgery, so Mike Tomczak got stuck doing all of Miles' work on this project. So it worked out pretty good for Miles. He gets all the credit, and Mike did the work. So, you know, make sure you thank everybody for that. A little bit about myself, just so you understand where I'm coming from. My name is Dennis Lowe, and I'm an agent assigned to the Clandestine Drug Lab unit at BCI. And our primary focus is to go out and handle methamphetamine-related issues and process clandestine drug labs as we find them. And when I talk about laboratories as we go throughout this presentation, I think you'll quickly realize that I'm not talking really about anything anyone in here could recognize as a laboratory from any kind of high school or college chemistry class. It's more often than not what looks like a lot of trash and improvised chemicals and improvised equipment used to make methamphetamine. And my unit's a pretty small unit. There's only 4 of us, so we stayed very busy with this issue, and I'll give you some numbers to back that up here coming up. I'm assigned to the Southeastern District of Ohio, which is about 25 counties for BCI in Southeast Ohio. I really love it down there. How many people in here from like Northwest Ohio? Raise your hands. You guys? How long did it take you to get here? About 6-7 hours? Did you guys leave yesterday? Welcome. If you've never been to Southeast Ohio before, it's a different and unique place, the Appalachian foothills of the Buckeye State. For all my brethren and sisters that are from Southeast Ohio here, welcome. It's a pleasure. I have been a police officer since 1984, and I don't want anybody in here to hold that against me. I know that there are some retired police officers in this group. There are some guys that are current police officers in this group. You know, definitely a way to put food on my table. For 18 and a half years in my law enforcement career, I worked undercover in our narcotics section and went around the state of Ohio buying drugs and seizing drugs from folks. And I had long hair and earrings and tattoos and goatees and the whole thing. And, well, quite honestly, I looked like a lot of ODOT employees. It's kind of where I was at with that. Yes. I didn't know if I should open with that or just come up here and lean on a shovel for a minute. I was one of, oh, hey. I'll spread the love, I promise. I will make fun of law enforcement before this presentation's over. But you guys do a great job out there keeping the highways open and safe. And I travel on them frequently by vehicle and motorcycle, so thank you for all of your hard work. As a Clan Lab guy here in Southeast Ohio, I stay pretty busy. I'm also assigned to the Drug Enforcement Administration's office here in Columbus, Ohio, as their Clan Lab coordinator, so I handle all lab issues for them. And I was talking to Brad before this. He asked me, how many presentations do you do a year? And last year I did about 160 presentations around the state, and being a full-time speaker and trainer is now my full-time job, I think. I still respond to Clan Labs and process meth labs around the state of Ohio, but coming out and talking to groups like this is what I do primarily. And I just want this out in the open right now that this is going to be a very uncomfortable presentation for me because I have a touch of ADD. And for those of you that have seen me speak, you know I like to move around the room a lot. I like the wireless microphone, and I'm all over the room. And standing here behind the podium so they can videotape me is a rather uncomfortable position for me to be in. So I'm going to be fidgeting a little while. If I start to step away from the podium, the audio-video guys back there, there's one running the camera equipment and another one with a sniper rifle that's trained on me. I'm looking at him right now. He's got a taser back there. So I'm going to have to stay here at the podium. I don't like that, but that's the way we're going to have to go with this. And I am going to go through the presentation, and I really want you to write down questions that you have throughout these slides, because the whole goal of this program was to not just give you this information and let you have it and do whatever you want with it, but it was kind of to foster a train-the-trainer program, if you will, and create some capacity for this training to go on and continue throughout the state of Ohio. So once I'm done with the presentation, we'll take a short break, as Brad mentioned, and then I'm going to come back through and we're going to break it down slide by slide, and you can ask all the questions you ever wanted to ask about methamphetamine and the particular slides that we're talking about, and I'll give you some insight as to what points I was trying to make and the group was trying to make as we put those slides together. So this is an ODOT product. This is not the BCI presentation that I normally do, so those of you that have seen me speak in the past, you'll be getting a little different flavor, I think, from this presentation. Now, I have to say, doing a lot of training around the state of Ohio, I think training is maybe the most important thing we do, and getting information that's going to help us do our jobs and do it safely. And safety training, it's an incredible sense of satisfaction for me, because I know that ultimately somebody that's listening to me speak, particularly on this subject, it may save themselves from injury or even worse when it comes to methamphetamine. So it's kind of exciting for me to do that. And I think going to training is nice. I heard somebody talking this morning. They were like, man, I'm just glad to be out of the office for a day. I can't tell you how happy I am to be out of the office and out of the district. And the guys from Northwest Ohio, are you staying tonight in Columbus and going back tomorrow? No? You should think about that. Now, you got a day away from the office. You're going to make the most use of it. But thinking about making the most use of training, that's a really important idea. It's nice to go and see pictures and hear somebody talk, and maybe they entertain you a little bit. But what you do with that training is really what counts, and how you use it. And whether you go back and you talk to other people at your district and you share that information and you promote it. And when it comes to methamphetamine and meth labs, that's probably the key to this problem, is awareness and spreading that information. So that's kind of where I'm going with that. And that kind of leads into a leadership thought. Now, for me, I have never been one to follow. I've always tried to be a leader when I can, and I'm not a manager at BCI, thank God. I'm a line-level guy. I go out there and I work in the trenches every day. Management has its place. But being a leader, I think, just to the other people you work with and the people in your lives, including your family, is an important concept. And when I think about that, we get young guys from time to time that come on at BCI, and it's important for folks that have been around for a while, that have some life experience in various fields, to share that information. And I've even passed that along to my children. And I've always tried to instill that in my boys, that I want them to be leaders and not followers. And I've always thought that was a good way to keep them maybe out of trouble. And I have a 17-year-old and I have a son that's in elementary school. And I think that is, it really hit home this year, how effective that can be. This fall, or last fall, I got a letter from my youngest son's school. And when you get a letter from the school, that's always a sickening feeling in your stomach. Anybody in here ever get a letter from your kid's school? You can imagine what you're thinking. Oh my God, what happened? So I opened the letter and I read this letter, and it was amazing. My son's teacher's telling me on picture day, all the kids get herded into the gym, and they got the bleachers set up and they're doing all that thing. And she said kids were just going nuts. Boys were running around pulling girls' pigtails, and boys were shooting each other with rubber bands and spit wads and acting like crazy people. And my son took it upon himself to try and help his teacher corral these kids. and get them all in line and move them around orderly and kind of keep control over everybody. So I'm a little Napoleonic complex or something there, but I was really proud that my son did it. She just wanted to thank me for, instilling those kinds of values in my son. So a couple months later, the envelope comes home with the pictures in it. I'm pretty excited to see these pictures. Well, my boy comes running in the house. He's waving the envelope. Dad, you got to look at this thing. It's unbelievable. Oh, my God, you won't believe it. So I pull this envelope open, and I look at that picture, and I shed a tear because it was the proudest moment I've ever had as a parent. And as a parent and an Ohio State Buckeye fan, I wanted to share that picture with you this morning. How about that? How about that kid of mine? Yes, he's something else. I got that picture off the internet, and you could tell that story and use that and do whatever you want with it, but it works pretty good for the purposes of this presentation. All right, let's talk about what we're going to talk about today, and certainly the extent of the problem with methamphetamine here in Ohio, and how it affects what you folks do and what your employees do out there is an important issue, and that's what brought us here. Methamphetamine, unfortunately, is not a fad. It's not something that is a flash in the pan. States out west, as Brad mentioned, that have been dealing with methamphetamine for 20 and 30 years, it's the number one drug problem in those areas. 85% of the crimes that are committed in those states are as a result of methamphetamine. And to give you some more information on that, methamphetamine is the number one abused hard drug in the world today. Throw some numbers at you. 26 million people around the world are addicted to methamphetamine. Now, that may not seem like a lot when you think about the population of the world, but I can tell you that it's more people addicted to methamphetamine than there are addicted to cocaine and heroin combined. This is a huge, huge problem, and it's a huge problem here in Ohio, but the awareness level is not where we need it yet. So we'll talk a little bit about the effects of meth, and then we'll just talk about what labs are and what qualifies as a lab, and really what's going to prompt a response from your folks in lab situations. And then I want to give you some information on hazards, the chemical and physical hazards associated with making methamphetamine, and what your folks are likely to be exposed to if they come in contact with this lab waste or dump sites or labs themselves in rest areas, which we find all across the state of Ohio. And I know that we've had some ODOT employees that have run over lab stuff in the ditches, mowing median strips and things like that, or have picked up bags of trash. There will probably be somebody in this room that's picked up a bag of lab waste and didn't realize what it was. So those are kind of some of the issues that we're going to go over, and we'll talk about what the protocols are here for ODOT concerning this issue. Now, when I talk about numbers and how big a problem this is, you can see in 5 years we went from 18 labs in 2000 to 500 labs last year. I just saw some numbers yesterday from the beginning of June 1st, we were at 270 labs for Ohio so far. Now, those are just the ones we found, the ones we know about. There's a lot more out there than we know about. One of the issues for us, when I talk to law enforcement groups, I'll say, well, what kind of meth problem do you have in your area? And typically I'll get a response like, well, we don't have any. We're not seeing it in our area. Well, why is that? Well, our narcotics agents or detectives, they're not buying it, and they're not seeing it. They're not seizing it out on the streets. So they don't think they have a meth problem. And unfortunately, here in Ohio, methamphetamine is not a drug that's being made for resale. People aren't making meth to get rich. This is a drug of abuse, and people are making this drug in these small toxic labs with these improvised chemicals and improvised pieces of equipment for their own personal use. And unless you're in their real small little clique or group, you would never know that methamphetamine's in your neighborhoods. But unfortunately, meth has an ability to impact all of society. Unlike any other drug I've ever seen, and I've seen everything there is to see, heroin and crack and cocaine and LSD and marijuana and ecstasy and anything you can imagine, prescription drugs. I've never seen anything that impacts our society like methamphetamine. I'll give you an example of that. I'm a very candid person, and I'll just tell you straight stuff here. Unless you're a crackhead, unless you are somebody that sells crack cocaine, or you're somebody that lives in a crack neighborhood, or you're somebody that drives through a neighborhood where crack is sold, you're probably not going to be exposed to crack cocaine in your normal everyday activities. Same thing with other drugs like heroin and LSD and ecstasy and things like that. Unless you're in that environment, you probably aren't being exposed to it. It's not a huge issue for you. But when I talk about methamphetamine, whole different story. Whole different story. We have people out there that are going to retail stores like Walmart and Meijer and Kroger and CVS and TSC and Ace True Value Hardware and Home Depot, picking up all the ingredients that they need to make methamphetamine and going out into their parking lot in their car and cooking dope right there in the parking lots. Making methamphetamine in their cars in those parking lots. We have people making methamphetamine all over Ohio that are saving up all of their waste materials from these labs and then taking it out and throwing it in a dumpster in somebody's apartment complex or some church's dumpster, or they take it out and throw it in a ditch line along the interstate somewhere on some county road or township road, or they dump it in somebody's front yard. And that lab waste is just as hazardous as if you were to walk into that lab environment while they were manufacturing this drug. So you could see where even just going out grocery shopping, you could potentially come in contact with a meth lab or components of a lab. Anybody in here from Hocking County? Anybody? Hocking County, just down the road here, about 40 miles southeast of Columbus, we had a meth lab in a Walmart parking lot there. And that's just one case of many around the state of Ohio. So it's a huge, huge problem. Now, when I talk about those numbers, that 500 labs that we found, 75% of those were found inadvertently. They were found by other people doing other things, whether that was law enforcement officers out stopping cars for speeding, or going to houses on domestic disputes, or it was fire and EMS workers going to a house for an emergency call, or it was a children's services worker out doing a home visit, or an ODOT employee out mowing the median strips or the ditch lines, or somebody working, picking up trash by the side of the road and they ended up finding a dump site or a lab waste site. 75%. That's the bulk of them. We only find 25% on purpose, where we get information. We have tons of information. The problem with this drug is we don't have the resources to work those cases. We don't have the resources at the law enforcement level around the state to work them. 25% of that 500 labs were dump sites. Just little itty bits of components, pieces, parts of meth labs where people had taken their lab waste and thrown it out. And quite often, I'll go out to a dump site like that. It's just really something that you folks would be in a position to come in contact with. And I'll do testing of the bags for toxic and poisonous gases and find poisonous gas in trash bags. I'll find poison and toxic materials in mason jars and plastic Gatorade bottles and pop bottles. And I'll find these chemicals in these trash bags that when you move the bag, there's a chemical reaction that takes place and starts producing toxic and poisonous gases. So it's a really, really dangerous situation. Now, what is methamphetamine? Because a lot of people will ask me that, and I'm trying. Did I move around too much? He's giving me the high sign back there. What is this drug? Well, it's a central nervous stimulant. It's a really highly powerful and addictive one. It acts in your body very similar to cocaine, but that's kind of where the similarities stop. And I'll give you a good example of that. If we were to do a line of cocaine, and I'm not suggesting that we should, but if we were to put one out here right now and take that cocaine, realistically, cocaine's going to last in our body for about 35 to 45 minutes. That's the duration or the half-life of that drug in your body. This drug, methamphetamine, this central nervous stimulant, if we take the exact same amount of it, you're going to be high for about 8 to 12 hours. 8 to 12 hours. So you're talking about something with a much longer lasting effect in your body. And I can tell you, in all the years that I've been working dope and drugs in Ohio, I have yet to find one single person from South America flying up here a plane load of coca leaves, offloading that, and pressing out bricks of cocaine here in Ohio. But there are a whole lot of people making this drug in their homes and in their cars and in their barns and by the sides of the roads and in farm fields all over Ohio. It's not a difficult process. We'll talk a little bit about it coming up here. Very, very simple to make methamphetamine. So that's a huge issue. Much bigger bang for my buck, and I don't have to go on the street to get it. I can make it at home. I can go to the Walmart or the Meijer and pick up everything I need to make meth. How many of you would rather jump in a bus right now and run over to a super Walmart and come back here and cook a batch of dope? Anybody? Be more fun than listen to me talk, I'm sure. But that's about how simple it is. We could make methamphetamine in about 4 hours. if we really wanted to. Looks very similar to cocaine. Usually we're shooting for a powdered form of this drug when we see it, but it really takes on a lot of different shapes and colors and sizes, and it's dependent upon what recipe they use to make it and what stage of the process you see it. But I've seen it look like the oatmeal looking material there, or shards of glass. I've seen powders that are red and pink and yellow and green. I've seen peanut butter looking meth and cottage cheese looking meth, so it takes on a lot of different shapes and colors. Most people snort it or smoke it. Those are the two primary methods of ingestion. But we have seen kind of an uptick there in the number of people that are injecting methamphetamine. Come on, clicker. Chemical hazards at lab sites and associated with making methamphetamine. We're talking about a lot of flammable materials and combustible materials, reactive materials that react to different elements, corrosive and caustic and toxic materials. Those are just to name a few of the issues that we're dealing with when we come in contact with the chemicals used to make methamphetamine. Now, I'm not a chemical engineer. I'm a police officer that knows a little bit about making methamphetamine, but it didn't take me long to figure out that anything that ended in ick, iv, or ibble was really bad, so we should leave that clear alone. Chemicals used to make meth are pretty volatile and explosive, and I think that we have evidence of that here recently, where we've had 4 labs in the last 3 months in Ohio that we're aware of blow up and explode, and had people on fire and running for their lives, and neighborhoods in danger because of the house next to them had a meth lab in it. These folks are amateur chemists at best. They really don't understand these processes and what these chemicals are capable of doing. For example, they'll take a mason jar and pour ether from starting fluid into it, which is a really flammable material, creates these really flammable atmospheres because ether vapor's pretty nasty stuff, and they'll pour that into a coffee pot or something and smoke a Marlboro and not think that there's anything wrong with that logic, and blow their meth lab up. Hazardous waste from these lab sites, and believe me, there's a ton of it, is typically they'll bury it or they'll burn it in barrels or pits, but the bulk of it, I think, or what we see, is just dumped. It's dumped by the side of the road somewhere, whether it's in somebody's yard or along one of your interstates or township roads. We see a tremendous amount of this material being dumped. And typically, these folks tend to save up this lab waste. As they're manufacturing batches of methamphetamine, they're saving this waste material up. And once they get a big collection of it, then they take it out and they dump it somewhere. Sometimes it's in garbage bags, sometimes it isn't. And unless you're really paying attention to what you're looking at, lab waste looks just like every other bag of trash out there in a lot of cases. You know, there isn't always going to be a telltale sign where something's off-gassing or emitting vapors and things like that that would clue you into what you're looking at. Exposures from lab materials and lab waste. There's really kind of 2 exposures that we deal with when we talk about labs. There are acute exposures, and an acute exposure to any kind of toxin or poison is when you're getting a whole bunch of something all at one time. And when that happens, whoever that person is that suffers that exposure, they're going to know right away they have a problem. And when we talk about lab waste and lab materials, it's usually going to be some type of respiratory problem initially, where they're going to have a lot of difficulty breathing. They may be expelling mucus and blood and other fluids from their body orifices from those exposures. So an acute exposure is going to be a bunch of something all at once. The ones that worry me, though, are the chronic type exposures that we see from lab waste material. And that's where people are handling these items and they spend a few minutes or an hour, a half hour, it's in the back seat of their car, in their truck, and they're getting a chronic exposure or a smaller dose over a longer period of time. And sometimes the effects of those chronic exposures aren't immediate. You don't see them right away. And we've had instances where people have had a chronic type exposure to some lab material and they felt fine. And they went home at the end of the day, and everything was good. And 5 or 6 hours later, they're sitting at home in their living room, and they start developing symptoms: rapid respiration, or chest pain, or vomiting, or diarrhea, headache, those types of things. And they think they have the flu or caught some, cough or something at work, when in actuality they've been exposed to something at a potential lab site. And those types of exposures can be very significant. Factors that determine exposure levels. There's a lot that goes into it. First, whether it's an acute or a chronic exposure, but people's age and their health. You certainly have a great diversity of folks working for you in size, shape, whatever, and health status. You know, whether or not somebody's as physically fit as I am might determine whether or not they have a problem with an exposure. If you're really physically fit, you might be able to take a small dose of something and not have a great effect. I'll give an example of the type of toxins that I'm talking about and how this applies. In one of the recipes that we see here in Ohio, there's a gas that's produced that we find in this lab waste. It's called phosphine gas. And it's a deadly poisonous gas that you can't see, taste, or smell. And whenever that gas is produced in a meth lab, it's produced in great numbers. We have a scale or a guide that we use when we test the air that we're breathing at these lab sites to tell us whether or not it's safe for us to be in there without respiratory protection. And on that scale is a thing we call an IDLH, when a chemical in the atmosphere becomes immediately dangerous to your life and health. And when I talk about this phosphine gas that's produced at these the red phosphorus meth labs, it only takes about 50 parts per million of that in the atmosphere to be immediately dangerous to your life and health. At about 0.3 parts per million, which is almost nothing, 0.3 parts per million, you can start to suffer the effects of those exposures. But then you add in these factors, your age, your health, genetics, environmental factors, whether or not you're a smoker, whether or not you do other things that might cause your body to not have a lot of self-protecting factors. Those things are all playing into account as to how much of that stuff you would need to get in trouble. That 0.3 might be a 0.1, maybe all it takes to get you in trouble, or maybe it takes 20 parts per million in the atmosphere. So these are really important issues when it comes to a person's ability to fight off those types of toxins and poisons. So another good reason why at the end of this thing we're going to know we're just going to sprinkle some leave it alone dust on any kind of meth lab. Types of injuries. Inhalation injuries is the number one injury that we see reported from exposures at lab sites, and that's people breathing in gases. Some of the pieces of equipment that are used produce these acid gas vapors, and we see people running over those containers with lawnmowers and picking them up and starting chemical reactions and breathing in an acid gas vapor out of a pop bottle or something that acts in your body the same way cyanide gas does. We see people suffering burns from fires and explosions. Now, that's more typical of somebody that's right at the lab site, but certainly you could pick up a bag of trash or lab waste or even one or two components and start a chemical reaction that could cause a fire or an explosion. We see that happen routinely. I do that at lab sites when I'm going through people's trash at their houses. We'll move a container and start a chemical reaction in the trash. A little better for me because I'm protected with some equipment, but certainly that's an issue. And then acid burns is a huge deal for us. And a lot of these folks that are manufacturing meth suffer any number of these injuries, if not all of them, from their exposures. They use a lot of concentrated acids to make methamphetamine. So when we find this lab waste, there's usually gallon jugs of sulfuric acid or hydrochloric acid or hydriodic acid or hypophosphorous acid, all these very strong concentrated acids, and it's very routine to find those containers with remnants of those acids inside, and we see people getting burns or suffering burns from those acids. So it's really dangerous stuff. Oral ingestion of toxins, that's certainly picking things up, ingesting those vapors and things as you're working around it. Skin absorption is certainly an issue for us. If you're wearing the protective equipment we're going to talk about later on, might not be as big an issue, but it can happen, particularly for methamphetamine. When these folks are manufacturing methamphetamine, they're producing thousands of micrograms of meth all over their lab and their lab equipment. So all of the lab trash that you're coming in contact with not only has its own toxic properties, now you have to look at the toxic levels of methamphetamine that might be on it. Now, it's not something that you would see like a dust or a coating on these materials. It would be very difficult to see them with the naked eye, but certainly you come in contact with those things and you're going to pick methamphetamine up and have it on your hands and your shoes and your clothing. And I want you to think about how many times a day you touch your face, or you rub your eyes when it's a hot day trying to wipe sweat out of your eyes, or you smoke a cigarette and you've got methamphetamine on your fingers and now you're ingesting methamphetamine. So that's definitely something we're concerned about. Slip, trip, and fall hazards are more pronounced at the actual lab site. But when we find these folks that just dump tremendous amounts of these things, it could be an issue there as well, or the location that they dump stuff. We had one gentleman that thought it was a good idea to dump 100 cans of empty Coleman fuel and all of his lab waste into a spillway down in the Muskingum River down in Stockport near Morgan County. So certainly I was working off of like a 60-foot cement wall trying to retrieve all this stuff. So slip, trip, and fall issues, which I think is a standard safety concern regardless of what you're doing, is an issue at labs also. Minimum personal protective equipment. Now, for the purposes of what your folks are doing out there, picking up waste and trash by the side of the road, or potentially coming in contact with these things in broken down vehicles or at rest areas, we definitely would like to have them at least with this bare essential equipment. Nitrile gloves, we put that on the list because nitrile is a good chemical barrier. And I don't know how many of you or people that work with you or for you are wearing latex gloves out there picking up trash and things like that, but latex is a very poor chemical barrier. You definitely don't want to be wearing latex gloves and coming in contact with any of these items. So nitrile is a much better alternative, and it's what we wear. Outer work gloves would definitely be something we want to have, and eye protection. That's a huge deal. Proper footwear. Proper footwear would be probably anything but flip-flops or sandals, and I don't know how many of your folks are wearing flip-flops out there on the highways. I hope none, especially if there's any big bosses in here. They don't want to hear that. But we want to wear proper footwear. Boots and steel-toed boots and things like that are great. Even if you have boots that might have chemical properties or chemical barrier properties would be good. The grabbers, I guess, is that the official term, Brad? ODOT grabber? The ODOT grabbers are good. We definitely don't want to handle any of these materials with our hands unless we have to. And then water, not just for hydration purposes and drinking water while you're out there picking this stuff up in the hot sun, but to wash your eyes or your face if you had an accidental exposure, because particularly with the acids, that water is going to be something that can neutralize the effects of that acid rather quickly. So having a good supply of water, and maybe even some kind of emergency eye wash or a spray bottle with some water is a good thing to have. Double trash bags, yeah, you definitely want to have double trash bags picking this stuff up. And then first aid kits. And I'm sure that there are first aid kits out there available to you, but I would be looking for something more than just a couple Band-Aids and a tube of antiseptic cream. Not an emergency trauma bag that a paramedic might be bringing around, but something that might have some bandages for cuts and abrasions, something that you could carry that eye wash in. But having some type of first aid kit, I think all of these things would be appropriate for litter pickup. Contamination issues. I mentioned it earlier with the methamphetamine. Every lab and lab component is contaminated. It's contaminated with stuff. Now, the bulk of the chemicals used to make methamphetamine have short half-lives. And what I mean by that is over a short period of time, over days, maybe weeks, those chemicals tend to evaporate into the atmosphere and become other things. But when you come in contact with this stuff initially, or when it has not evolved, if you will, that's when it becomes really, really dangerous stuff. And all of the chemicals that we see used to make methamphetamine, and they're commercially available products, they're all neurological toxins to some extent. Some of them are respiratory toxins and poisons. Those acids that I mentioned earlier, those are all things that we want to be concerned about. Gross contamination situations, those are issues where maybe a lab's exploded and splattered chemicals and other materials all over walls, and that might happen in a vehicle where potentially you might be exposed to it. It's not beyond the realm of possibility to think, though, that somebody could go into a rest area and cook a batch of dope in a rest area restroom. And I know that in most of the modern or more modern rest areas, it's probably unlikely to find that taking place. But I can think of places that are really kind of remote rest areas, maybe just have an outbuilding or something, and somebody could sneak in there. They could be making methamphetamine in the parking lot in their vehicles or in the trees. You don't necessarily need electricity or some type of secured facility to make meth. You can make meth in the middle of an open field. So you might definitely come in contact with it there. I think one of the big issues for us as far as contamination comes when people are going beyond the scope of their capabilities. And I'll just explain that, or what I mean by that. To become lab certified, you have to have a special certification as a police officer to go in and work around these toxic environments and handle these materials. And you have to go through a hazardous waste operators training course. The gentlemen in my unit all go through a technician level hazardous waste handlers course. We've been through site safety training and confined space training, a lot of hazardous materials training, a lot of clandestine drug lab specific training. I've been to maybe 200 labs or so in the last 5-6 years, and when it comes to dealing with methamphetamine and this issue, I'm very comfortable. I enjoy talking about it. I like looking at this stuff and handling it. I've kind of found my niche. Took me 40 years to get one, but I finally got it. Other people may not have that same level of training or that same comfort level dealing with these materials. And it's important to recognize that. And law enforcement are the worst offenders of this, because we have guns and badges and we stand 10 foot tall. We think we're invincible and we can do anything. And we don't necessarily have to follow all of these kinds of rules, and it happens all the time. This is the number one offender for law enforcement, is they'll come in contact with something like this and they'll think, it's probably nothing, or it's no big deal, and they continue doing whatever they were going to do, collecting evidence. They get an exposure and they end up in the hospital or worse. Happens all the time. A lot of police officers here in Ohio have been victim of this, and I certainly don't want to see anybody from ODOT end up a victim of this, where you look at something by the side of the road and you go, it could be, but it's probably not, and they pick it up and throw it in their truck, or they go through the bag, or they see something that looks like roadside treasure. I'm looking, one gentleman and I talked about that this morning, that, a lot of these containers and stuff are pretty appealing. And where I work in Southeast Ohio, somebody leaves a 5-gallon plastic gas can by the side of the road. I know fellers that get in a fist fight to get that thing in the back of their truck. I know guys that tip over a dump truck to get a bungee cord that just got dropped off their truck. So it becomes problematic because people, they get lackadaisical at times. They don't know someone personally that's been injured like this. They don't believe that it's a reality, and they put themselves unnecessarily in harm's way. Happens all the time. And I'm really a big advocate of always assuming the worst when it comes to this stuff. When it comes to making a determination of whether or not you're looking at a lab, you always want to assume that it is and find out it's not. Find out it's not. That's a mistake you can make 500 times, and nothing bad's going to happen to you, other than you might waste an hour of your day waiting on law enforcement to get there and look at it and determine that it's not lab related. But when you think that it ain't and find out it is, that's a problem or a mistake you might only get to make one time. So it's really important to always assume the highest hazard category. Wrong or no personal protective equipment, that's a huge issue. That leads to a lot of contamination issues for not only law enforcement and fire and EMS, but you folks as well. Out there picking up that trash and getting kind of lax, and it looks just like every other plastic bottle that you've picked up or a bag of waste, and you get exposed to something. Incidental contact, certainly accidental exposures where you've bumped into something, or I mentioned you pick something up and you start a chemical reaction inside a container or a bag that you can't stop. Those types of injuries happen. And then intentional acts by offenders. That's more pertinent for law enforcement, where we have folks that go in to seize these laboratories and the, what's the proper term here? Bad guys, for what I can't say what I'm thinking. The bad guys will start a chemical reaction to injure law enforcement on purpose, or they'll splash acid on people, or they'll open up a propane tank full of anhydrous ammonia and release that into a house. So there's potential that could happen. It's very unlikely that it would happen to anybody working for ODOT, but it could. Particularly if somebody's at a rest area or something making methamphetamine, or you catch them right in the act of dumping this stuff and they smash a container and start a chemical reaction that could cause you some very significant life-threatening injuries. The tendency is to make this the boogeyman, if you will, to make it worse than it possibly could be. And I'm here to tell you, excuse me, that it's not. Now, are hundreds and hundreds of people being killed all over Ohio from meth lab exposures? No, but there are a lot of people getting injured as a result of this, of meth and meth lab material. A lot of times they don't realize that that's what they've been exposed to. Decontamination, that's a big word for just taking care of yourself. You know, if you're out there picking this stuff up or you come in contact with what you think is lab related, it's extremely, extremely important that you do some minimal amount of decon. And by that I mean wash your hands and face first and foremost immediately. You want to get your hands and face clean as soon as possible. You want to think about what you've been bumping into and what you were handling and not doing some of those things that I mentioned earlier about touching your face and smoking cigarettes after direct contact with these things. So it's really going to be dependent upon the exposure. Now, just because you came in contact with meth lab waste doesn't mean that you need to destroy all of your clothing and get rid of everything and burn it in a pile and, you know, all of that. It simply can be a matter of just washing your hands and face, maybe using some of the hand sanitizers or antiseptic wipes to wipe yourself down. Unless you have a splash or some type of spill, that type of dry decontamination will usually take care of everything. Don't take it home is an important concept. I want you guys and girls to think about what you're out there walking around in, what you're coming in contact with, and where you take that material, where you take it. Think about what you step in all day long and then you're taking back into your vehicles, whether they're your vehicle or ODOT's vehicles. Think about what you're taking back to the ODOT garage, or how many of you in here, I don't even know if you're allowed to do this at ODOT, but, you know, go home for lunch. Work in the morning and then go home for lunch or something. Think about what you're taking back to your families that you've come in contact with. So it's really important, I think, to get your shoes cleaned at the end of the day, particularly if you've been in contact with any of this type of stuff. What does a meth user look like if you happen to run across one of these folks? Well, I'm here to tell you, if you ever do, you won't forget it. They're a pretty unique creature, meth amphibians, as we like to call them. Generally, 20 to 50 is about the bulk of what we see, age range using this drug, but we do see younger people using it. We see older people using it. I got to tell you, what's the big appeal? You look at this picture and you hear about these chemicals and things that are in this drug. Why would anybody take it? Why would anybody take it? Well, the first thing that's going to happen when you take methamphetamine is there is going to be this unbelievable, intense, euphoric, happy feeling like you have never experienced in your life. Never. I want you to think back to a moment in your life when you've been as happy as you have ever possibly been. The greatest single moment of joy in your life. For me, it was looking at that picture of the Michigan kid on the other side of the bench. No, it was, you know, I got lots of them, you know. First, when I got my Harley Davidson motorcycle, I don't think I could have ever been any happier than that day. Think about that euphoria. And the high that you get from methamphetamine is 500 times that. You cannot replicate it in nature. So there's this unbelievable euphoric feeling that comes over you. Something else that happens when you take methamphetamine is there's this initial wave in huge sexual desires. You're more sexually aroused under the influence of methamphetamine than you've ever been in your life. So now you've got this incredible, happy, euphoric feeling, and you're more sexually charged up than you've ever been in your life. There's also an appetite suppressant that goes along with meth. You don't feel like eating. So now I'm really happy, I'm really sexually excited, and I don't feel like eating. That's some pretty good stuff. If it was just that, I would have issued meth to everybody as you came in the room today. That's a big, big draw for people. But then we start looking at some of the other effects of this drug, some of the physical effects of what meth does to people. Your heart rate's going to shoot up to about 130, 40 beats a minute. Your blood pressure goes through the roof. Your body temperature goes through the roof, sometimes over 100 degrees, and you can't get cool. So think about sitting around for 8, 9, 10, 12 hours just sweating like crazy, and you can't stop it. It's very common for us to find meth heads, meth tweakers, sitting around in their houses or cars or wherever naked because they can't get cool. So they just take all their clothes off and sit around the house playing PlayStation and taking apart their stereo systems because that's another thing they love to do. You know, those are some of the physical factors. Your pupils are going to dilate wide open. You'll have probably some twitches and tremors. You won't be able to sit still. If you're a heavy meth user, you'll probably lose 50 to 100 pounds in a year. That's pretty good stuff there. I don't think Jenny Craig's even close to 50 to 100 pounds in a year. So you look at those physical factors, premature aging, sores and abrasions. that come along with using meth. When you're under the influence of methamphetamine, your skin dries out really bad, and you can't stop scratching and picking and itching yourself. So these folks just sit around constantly digging and scratching and picking at their hands, their arms, their face, their legs. We call them meth bugs or meth sores because you'll see these on anybody that's been using methamphetamine for any decent time at all. You see those meth bugs. Something else that contributes to that is they will sometimes have tactile hallucinations where they feel like bugs are crawling around on or under their skin. So now they're digging and picking at these spots and scratching at themselves, and they feel like bugs are crawling around on them, and we have folks that will actually take knives and forks and other implements and just tear the flesh right off of their arms and legs trying to get to these bugs and stuff. So those are some exciting physical factors. Your saliva glands dry up while you're under the influence of meth. It's like the worst case of hangover Cottonmouth you've ever had. Not that anybody in here would ever know what that is like, but if you had, you can relate. So they have this cotton mouth, all the saliva dries up in their mouth, all this bacteria is building up in their mouths. They're having acid reflux, and then acid's laying in their mouth. They're ingesting methamphetamine that may have acid residue on it, and that bacteria and acid and all these other things start to eat away at their teeth and gums. So you're going to see really bad dental work on methamphetamine addicts. And I'm talking as horrific a dental image as you can possibly have right now. So those are some of the physical factors. Psychologically, methamphetamine does some things to people's brains too. Does some pretty severe things. Over time, people under the influence of methamphetamine will develop paranoid schizophrenic-like behavior. They'll become paranoid schizophrenics, for lack of a better term. They become very aggressive or prone to aggressive behavior and sudden mood changes. They become violent, and we see the most extreme behaviors associated with these folks. Now, when people are using drugs, we see a tendency for people that are hardcore drug users to be binge users. They'll go on these bingers, or where somebody will use a drug, they'll use it for 4 or 5 days, and then maybe not use it for a couple days, and then they go back on another binge. We see that same type of binging behavior with methamphetamine, but let me talk about how meth is different. I mentioned earlier that the effects of methamphetamine can last for 10 to 12 hours in your system. You guys remember that? Now, think about that euphoric rush that I talked about, and that only lasts for about 45 minutes, that real intense euphoria. Then the normal high sets in, and you're high for 9, 10 hours. Well, what these folks don't understand is that euphoric rush only lasts that short amount of time, so as soon as the euphoria wears off, they take another dose of methamphetamine. Well, that drug is still in their body and still active from the first hit, so they just keep building upon that dose. They keep building upon that dose. And routinely, we'll see people binging on this drug for 5 to 10, 15 days at a time. Now, while you're under the influence of methamphetamine, you're not sleeping typically, or at all, if any. You're not sleeping. Has anybody in here ever been up for 5 to 10 days without sleep? Yeah, imagine that, and then add the influence of this drug. Now you add sleep deprivation to that. You add the fact that these people typically aren't eating or eating well. If they're eating, it's usually a lot of sugary foods. It's a lot of Red Bull and those high sugar energy drinks, Mountain Dew. Meth tweakers love Mountain Dew. Love it. Let's chase my methamphetamine high with a 12 ouncer of Mountain Dew. So it becomes pretty significant, and that's when we see some really abstract and violent behavior, is when these people are on these 10, 15-day binges. And that's fairly common. 5 to 10 days is what we're seeing out there. Here's some premature aging. That's about 3.5 years of meth use for Teresa Baxter there. You can see what this drug does to people. I'm here to tell you, too, in 6 years of working nothing but methamphetamine here in Ohio, I have yet to find one single recreational meth user. This isn't a drug that people can use recreationally like they use other drugs. And this is probably not the party line, but there are recreationally used drugs out there like marijuana and cocaine. There are people that do cocaine over the weekend and party it up and live like rock stars and then go back to work on Monday morning. And they're able to function like that. I don't see that same recreational behavior with methamphetamine. The people that we talk to that use this drug say it's the worst of the worst, that nothing has ever impacted their lives like methamphetamine, that it's the hardest drug to get away from. Unless they're specifically treated for methamphetamine, And that is a lengthy process, usually up to a year of intense rehab treatment, 90% relapse rate for people that seek treatment for meth use. But we don't see it. The treatment folks here in Ohio are not seeing people seeking treatment from this drug. They really like the way they feel. They feel energized and they can get a bunch of stuff done for a while. So what is a meth lab? You've heard me use that term lab over and over and over. It's really any component, any piece or part of hazardous material that's associated with the manufacture of methamphetamine. That's what we use to define a lab. And that could be a whole bunch of glassware and Bunsen burners and test tubes and things you might recognize as being chemistry lab equipment, or it could be one single mason jar, or a plastic bag with some chemicals in it by the side of the road. So it really spans a wide range of things there. And quite honestly, 95% of the labs we come in contact with look like this thing in the bottom left picture here, where it's a lot of improvised equipment, a lot of improvised chemicals. When I talk about labs, I want you to understand there's a couple different types of labs. We have what we call super labs, and those are laboratories that are real pronounced out on the West Coast and in Mexico, where we have Mexican national drug organizations that are producing methamphetamine in labs at 10 to 100 pounds per cook. And these folks are using 22-liter round-bottom reaction flasks to cook dope in. They're using 55-gallon drums of solvents like Freon and ether. They're using bed sheets as filters. And even without the advent of any type of awareness level training, anybody in this room that saw something like that would probably know that's some kind of lab, bad news right there. By contrast, your meth cooks here in Ohio, where we live, are producing about 4 to 10 grams of methamphetamine per cook. And if you don't know how much a gram is, it's what's inside a sweet and low packet or an equal packet. That's a gram. So it's very small amounts of this drug. And they're using these commercially available products that each and every one of us have. Everybody in this room probably has 3/4 of what you need to make meth at your house right now. A lot of you have it. Some of you may have more. Some of you may have everything. Anybody want to raise your hand? No? All right. All right. Mike knows who they are. All right, Mike? So that's problematic. And the real issue for me there is because these labs are typically small, because these quantities of these materials can be small, and because you have everything at your house or you've come in contact with almost every one of these products and items at your own home, you have a comfort level in dealing with them. How many of you would see a can of lantern fuel laying on the ground in a ditch by the road somewhere and be afraid of that? And think of that as something hazardous. A lot of you probably have that, or a can of paint thinner, or a bottle of drain opener, or a container of iodine, or a 12-ounce pop bottle, or a 2 or 3 gallon red gas can sitting in a ditch somewhere. Those are all things that we have in our own homes, and we're used to seeing them and dealing with those products. So it becomes very problematic in identifying that, something dangerous that's meth-related, as opposed to the regular junk we all have in our own homes. Where are you going to find a lab? I would love to tell you that these things are strictly located in hillbilly white trash America, and unless you live in one of them places, you'll never see one. And there's some people that believe that, but that's not the case at all. We find labs in nice suburban communities, Westerville, Ohio, nice little suburb of Columbus here. We found one in a very nice neighborhood there at a very nice home, and outraged the community. They couldn't believe they had a meth lab in Westerville, but they did. Just like the ones we find in everywhere else in Ohio. We find a lot of labs in suburban communities here in Ohio. This is a drug that has a perception that it is a poor white trash type drug, but that's not the truth. It spans every aspect of society you can imagine. We've arrested housewives, and we've arrested accountants and lawyers and professional people, nurses, using methamphetamine. Managers and other corporate type people using this drug. So it isn't just something that's going to affect, some Ohio River community that none of us might ever get to. We find a lot of mobile labs, and what I mean by that is a lab or components of a lab contained in a car. And usually it's a setting where somebody's transporting their lab from point A to point B. but a really dangerous situation. RVs and trailers, which I know you folks never see any of those ever, right? Roadsides and ditch lines. I can't tell you how many labs and dump sites we find in ditch lines and by the sides of the roads. Tons and tons of them. Tons of them. I would say the vast majority of the dump sites that I've been to have all been at a ditch line or on a roadside somewhere. I get to a few that are back in the woods, but it's pretty rare. It's usually more convenient to just dump it out at the side of the road, just like this cylinder here in the ditch line. Just because we don't have necessarily the glassware or the improvised equipment and the chemicals in a container doesn't mean that it doesn't pose a significant health threat. We find a lot of labs and lab equipment in ice chest and igloo coolers. And this one in particular with a lot of iodine remnants in it. Iodine is something that's used in one of the main recipes we see here in Ohio. And iodine in and of itself is extremely toxic. It's very toxic. That's why we only put small amounts of it on a cutter and abrasion. We're not dumping the whole bottle of iodine on our kids. Really dangerous stuff, especially if you breathe in the vapors from iodine. You may open a container like that and start one of those chemical reactions. God forbid somebody has booby-trapped a container, which we have found that to be happening around the state also. Gym bags and backpacks and duffel bags and purses and shopping bags. We find tons of labs and lab components in those types of storage containers. Propane tanks, our old friend the propane cylinder or the gas cylinder. We see a lot of propane tanks and other compressed gas cylinders used to contain a chemical called anhydrous ammonia, which is used in one of the recipes we find here in Ohio. And this anhydrous ammonia, when it's contained in one of these types of cylinders, is extremely dangerous. It's really dangerous. Does anybody in here have household ammonia at your house? Somebody's got it? Yeah. When you open up the container on your household ammonia, can you smell it? Oh, yeah, it'll open up your nasal passages. That ammonia that you probably have at your house is 3% ammonia, 97% water. Really kind of benign stuff. Doesn't seem like it when you smell it, but it's pretty benign. The ammonia that these guys are using, which is a commercially available fertilizer, is 82% concentrated ammonia. It's 82% concentrated ammonia. And when they steal it and they put it inside these tanks, what they don't understand is that ammonia boils at minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. So once it gets above minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, it can start to boil and expand inside these gas cylinders that aren't designed to hold 82% concentrated ammonia. And that gas can expand and those cylinders can rupture and release this ammonia. And if you come in contact with anhydrous ammonia, it will be something you never forget. It can cause blindness, severe burns to your skin, your throat. When you breathe it into your respiratory system, it causes something to build called ammonium hydroxide, which is a caustic material. It'd be like pouring caustic drain opener into your lungs when you breathe it. And it seizes your lungs up and you can't breathe. So when you die from an anhydrous ammonia exposure, you die from asphyxiation initially because you can't breathe anymore. But while that's going on, this ammonia, this caustic material is burning your skin. And I got a picture coming up to show you what that's all about. But when we deal with these cylinders, what we're really looking for are the brass fittings on these tanks, the valves. And anytime that ammonia comes in contact with the brass on these tanks, that brass is going to discolor. It's going to turn blue. It'll start out kind of a turquoise color, like you can see here in the top picture, but that blue will actually darken the more ammonia that this stuff comes in contact with. And I've actually seen those valves turn purple from severe corrosion. Well, the more corrosion, the more bluing there is on those valves, the more susceptible they are to rupturing and releasing their contents. This one was, I think this was off of I-70 somewhere out on the southwest end of the state. This was an anhydrous tank that was dumped off in a ditch line right off the interstate. And you can see how much damage the ammonia did to the grass there surrounding that cylinder. It's very common to find those tanks like that in gym bags and backpacks. What ends up happening is the guys will see that the tank is starting to deteriorate or corrode, and they'll just get rid of it, whether it has any ammonia in it left or not. And it's very common to find those cylinders like that. So we definitely want to keep your folks away from those things. That is a devastating injury if that happens. It's the #1 cause of injuries at lab sites all across the United States is exposure to this anhydrous ammonia. Just some more examples of this stuff. You can see they have their anhydrous tank here inside a backpack. You know, when it comes to determining whether this cylinder is being used for meth lab stuff, usually there's a couple of criteria. If there's any kind of alterations or modifications to those cylinders or any discoloration, those are the key things you want to focus in on. And you saw in the previous picture here, they spray painted it. That's very common. And regardless of the cylinder, this is a propane tank off a gas grill. We see oxygen tanks, we see fire extinguishers, we see tow motor propane tanks, air compressor tanks from people's garages. Any kind of compressed gas cylinder you can imagine, we see them using to hold this anhydrous ammonia. So any kind of modifications, I'm pretty sure they don't come from the marathon station with plastic tubing sticking out of the top of them, or 12 inches of galvanized pipe and a release valve. So any kind of modifications or alterations to those tanks, any kind of discoloration. And you can see the dark blue corrosion here on the brass fittings. Here's one that was just sitting out in the wood line. This was about 20 yards off the road. And there was about 200 pounds of this ammonia material in various cylinders there, and about 15 gallons of really strong sulfuric and hydrochloric acids there for anybody to come in contact with in Kool-Aid jugs and pop bottles. One of the real key things that I think would help you and the folks you're working with identifying the difference between a meth lab and just regular waste sitting by the side of the road are layers of things in bottles. When we deal with methamphetamine and meth labs, we're typically looking for layering of materials. Now, in this particular photograph, what you're seeing is they've broken down pseudoephedrine tablets and are extracting the main ingredient to make meth, pseudoephedrine, out of the tablets. But you can see the sediment-looking material in the bottom. So anytime your folks see containers with a sediment or solid material and a liquid on top, that's usually a pretty good indicator that what you're looking at is meth-related. It could also, though, be multiple layers of liquids. How many people in here have ever seen 7C salad dressing, oil and vinegar, when you put those two together, how you get the little oil layer? We'll see the same types of things with meth-related containers, where we'll have multiple layers of liquids. Sometimes an oil layer will form. So those are things that would clearly tell you what you're looking at. That lab waste can be just as hazardous as the lab itself. And recognizing things like this, which are cans of starting fluid with holes punched out, could tell you that you're looking at a meth lab. Now, it might not be. There is a really slim chance that that's not a meth lab or lab waste. You might also win the Powerball tonight, all right? But when I see cans of starting fluid with holes punched in them, that's definitely lab-related, or I'm going to treat it as such until I can show that it's not. Now, here in Ohio, we see a couple main methods of manufacture. The red phosphorus or red P method and the anhydrous ammonia or Nazi dope method. Now, there are other ways to make methamphetamine, but these are the two most popular that we see in Ohio. They're both basically the same recipe, folks. Both basically the same recipe. They both use pseudoephedrine as their main ingredient, over-the-counter cold medicine as their main ingredient. They just change a couple other ingredients to get to where they need to be. Now, why I bring that up is because here in Ohio, we see both of these recipes, and we see them kind of geographically. And what I mean by that is that U.S. Route 23, that runs north to south, is kind of a dividing line. And labs that we see to the west of Route 23 are typically anhydrous ammonia labs. More times than not, if you're west of Route 23 and you encounter a meth lab, it'll be an ammonia lab or remnants of an ammonia lab. The other way is, folks east of Route 23, you're typically going to find red phosphorus or red P labs. Different types of materials as far as the main ingredients go. The exact same equipment, though, is typically used. All of the containers, the glassware, the igloo coolers, all of that stuff, vinyl tubing, garden hose, coffee filters, all of those items are going to be used in both recipes. They're both very simple. You do not need a chemistry degree to make methamphetamine. You don't need any type of chemistry background or high school education. You don't even need to be able to read and write to make this drug. You just have to be able to follow directions. I mentioned pseudoephedrine. That's the main ingredient in making methamphetamine with either one of those two recipes. Got to have it. They have to have it. So finding a bunch of empty boxes of pseudoephedrine or the blister packs where the little tablets are would tell your folks that they're looking at lab waste, okay? Especially when they find large quantities of that stuff. Coffee filters, another huge thing we see associated with making methamphetamine. They're used throughout the process. We'll find coffee filters or shop towels or T-shirts used as filtering devices. And really what they're looking for there are things with unusual stains and colors or materials. Okay, I'm pretty sure that coffee grounds are not pink when we find those. Red phosphorus labs are indicative of having matches and matchbooks. You're going to find matches at those sites. Here's some matchbooks where they've removed the striker plates, getting the red phosphorus. So this is a real good depiction of red phosphorus lab trash. This particular type of lab where we find the matches is the one that produces that deadly poisonous gas that I mentioned earlier that you can't see, taste, or smell, that I have found in trash from those types of labs, that I found in those trash bags, that phosphine gas. Iodine is also used in this red phosphorus method, and it's toxic. Particularly, we'll see this tincture of iodine, which is a stronger iodine solution. We'll see that used by these lab operators, and you'll find these containers, just like you see them here in these pictures. The other thing you may see with iodine use is staining of coffee filters, T-shirts, glassware, plastic bags, tubing, hoses. Anything that iodine comes in contact with, it's going to stain it with that familiar iodine-colored stain. And that would tell you right away that what you're looking at is lab-related. There's a real good example of that. And this is pretty typical of what we see, and that's a meth lab. That's lab waste, but that's a meth lab, what you're seeing there. And I say that because everything in that picture is hazardous waste, it's hazardous material, and it poses a very significant health threat to you guys or other people like you if you come in contact with it. Cat litter, something else that we see used with methamphetamine manufacture, particularly cat litter containers with tubes and hoses in them. All right, I can't think of a good reason why cat litter would have a tube running into the container, so that's usually a clue, as we like to call it. Drain openers like Red Devil Lye, caustic drain opener, is used to make methamphetamine, so finding those containers. You know, there's really three things that I use to determine whether or not I'm looking in a lab. And the first one's usually location. Am I seeing these items, these ingredients, these pieces of equipment in places that I would normally expect to see them? Now, for you guys, it's a little different because you're probably not up into people's houses like I am. So the first one may not apply as much, but certainly the second two do, and it's quantity. How much of this stuff are you seeing? How much of it is there? And then combinations. When you start seeing these things in combinations with each other, you know that you're probably looking at lab-related material. And, you know, when I talk about drain openers, people will go, well, drain openers legal to own. How can you tell me how much drain opener I can have? I can't necessarily tell you how much you have, but I know what I have at my house, and I know what other people have at their house. And when I go to your house or your car and I find 8 gallons of drain opener in your car, you need a plumber, not 8 gallons of drain opener, so something's amiss. Flammable solvents. This is a big issue for us at lab sites, and these things can be really dangerous, present some very significant health threats for you and your employees. These folks love flammable solvents. They use them throughout the process. They're consistent in both recipes. Typically, we see ether from starting fluid or Coleman lantern fuel are probably the two most popular products that we see used, but they could use toluene, they could use xylene, paint thinner, petroleum naphtha, acetone. They may be using MEK paint thinner, which is methyl ethyl ketone. They may be using any of those types of products throughout the process. So we'll find these flammable solvents, and these things really cause some very flammable situations for us, particularly when you bag up a bunch of ether vapor or something inside a trash bag or inside a big container. Or, you know, we've had instances where folks have opened up containers and sparked an explosion. I talked about the bi-levels of liquids or the multiple layers of liquids. Here's a real good example of that. When you see those multiple layers of liquids and solids in containers, it's usually methamphetamine related. Good humor man in the house? That's okay. I'm just messing with you now. This one is a real significant hazard, and I think we'll be done here in 5 minutes, I think, and taking a break. This is an item that we find in great abundance that is really, really dangerous to anybody that comes in contact with it. And it's what we call a hydrogen chloride gas generator. And what goes on here is these people manufacture an acid gas vapor in a pop bottle like this, or a plastic gas can, or any other container that they can cap off. And they use that acid gas vapor to convert liquid methamphetamine into the powdered form of the drug, the solid. When that acid gas vapor comes in contact with that liquid, it turns that methamphetamine into a solid. Well, the problem we have here is that they'll put salt, table salt or rock salt, into the bottom of a pop bottle like that or other container, and then they'll pour in drain opener with sulfuric acid on top of that salt. And it starts this chemical reaction that produces this acid gas vapor. And the issue for us is when the good folks at the Pepsi Cola bottling company made that bottle of Mountain Dew, they did not put an on and off switch for the gas generator on there. So once you start that chemical reaction, you can't stop it. And they can't clamp the hose off that you see here because pressure builds up inside the bottle and it explodes and sprays sulfuric acid over everybody. So they just have to let it go. And typically we'll find these generators 1 or 2 days after the bad guys have used them, and they're still producing that acid gas vapor. You pick them up and they produce the acid gas vapor. You run over it with a lawnmower and a big cloud of acid gas vapor comes up, or you start an acid gas reaction. They're really, really dangerous. And when you breathe in this acid gas, it's in a sense the same thing as drinking acid into your respiratory system. Pouring sulfuric acid or hydrochloric acid into your respiratory system. So they are really, really dangerous, and they're characterized by any kind of container that they can cap off. Has to be able to put a lid on it, and it'll have a tube or a hose coming out of the top of it. Sometimes it'll even be wrapped up with duct tape, or as we like to call it back home, West Virginia chrome. I'll wrap a little of that around the top of it. Come on now, work with me on that. Drain openers, we see lots of drain openers used in the production of methamphetamine, and I mentioned those earlier. And those are those acids, those really strong concentrated acids. And I don't know if anybody in here has ever had the pleasure of having sulfuric acid poured on you before, but it burns. It's an unpleasant experience if you spill it on yourself or you come in contact with it, or hydrochloric acid, or hydriodic acid, or any number of these acids that we see out there. I mentioned the gas cans earlier. This is just exactly the same thing as the Mountain Dew bottle you just saw. It's just a different style of a container. Table salt and acid down inside of that. Nursery tanks of anhydrous ammonia. I don't know how many of you work in anhydrous country. Certainly the guys from up northwest Ohio are familiar with these things. During the spring, you can't go anywhere up there without hitting a nurse tank. The whole west end of the state, because of the agriculture there, is great frequency coming in contact with these nursery tanks of anhydrous. And that's where these guys steal the ammonia that they put into those gas grill propane tanks to manufacture methamphetamine. And here again are just some more examples of these different kinds of gas cylinders. And the more pressure that builds up inside those tanks from that ammonia boiling and expanding, the more likely a cylinder like this is to rupture. Or like the one we had at the Walmart parking lot in Logan last November, a little oxygen tank like that ruptured and it split open like a ballpark frank and released that anhydrous ammonia onto the people that were in the van with it. Now, fortunately, they were all bad guys, so it was a pretty cool deal, actually. Sorry. That's the jaded, cynical law enforcement officer. I apologize. I mentioned that discoloration of the brass. You can see how we went from turquoise down here to dark blue up here. Anytime you have that discoloration, any kind of modifications or alterations to any kind of gas cylinder, it's probably got anhydrous ammonia in it. And you definitely want to err on the side of caution and think that it is and find out it isn't. frost on cylinders and containers. That ammonia, when it's stored in those big nurse tanks that I showed you the picture of, it's stored at 44 degrees below zero inside those tanks. Stored at 44 degrees below zero. So when these gentlemen take it and steal it and put it into these other gas cylinders, those tanks will frost over, or the container will be covered in frost. So finding any kind of cylinders or containers with ice or frost on them is an absolute sign that you're dealing with ammonia, as evidenced here by this gas can. Now, I told you those cylinders have a propensity to rupture and release their contents. How would you like to be sitting in the car when that bad boy went off? This is a 20-pound propane tank that was full of this anhydrous ammonia that was shot on a firearms range with a rifle round. And you see the ammonia cloud that came out of it. That's that concentrated ammonia in gaseous form. That cloud came out of that tank within 2 seconds of that round impacting. That's how much gas came out of that thing. That ammonia itself, a gallon of that liquid anhydrous ammonia, can expand to about 865 gallons of gas within just a couple seconds. Fill a room full of gas. And that cloud right there, if you were standing in that thing without a respirator, an SCBA or an air tank or a chemical resistant suit, at the very least, you are going to get an exciting ride in an ambulance to the hospital. That's something that you may not recover from, that type of exposure, as did this gentleman here, who was in a vehicle where one of those propane tanks full of anhydrous ammonia ruptured, just like the last picture, and he was in that vehicle and got an acute exposure to anhydrous ammonia, and that's how the day ended for him. Now, I don't show this picture to be gratuitous. I don't show it to make fun of dead people. I show it because I want everybody in here to understand how dangerous this ammonia is and what exactly types of injuries could happen to you or your employees or people you work with if they come in contact with this. And I show this because I've seen people take those tanks, those propane tanks with anhydrous ammonia in them, and pick them up and go, is there anything in that? Shake it, throw it in the back of a truck, put it in their back seat of their car, drive around with it. It's really, really dangerous stuff. Now, another ingredient we see used in making meth, especially with the ammonia labs, are lithium batteries, lithium camera batteries. And so finding evidence of these Energizer, E-squareds, or any other lithium camera battery is somebody making methamphetamine, especially when they tear the batteries apart to get the lithium out of it, which is what they do. So we'll find battery waste like that. Finding that battery waste can tell you that you're dealing with a meth lab. Now, one of the dangers of this particular material is that this lithium metal, and inside those batteries is a little lithium metal strip. It's about this long, about that wide, and it's paper thin. And that lithium metal is water reactive. If you get any kind of water on it at all, it ignites and catches on fire, which is really bad if that happens in a bag full of ether gas, ether vapor. Yeah, so really dangerous stuff. So it's important that your folks recognize battery waste. All right, what would require a response by law enforcement? And that's really, again, any kind of quantities of these materials that we've been talking about and showing you pictures of, and any kind of combinations when you see those materials. Solvent containers and things. You know, one of the issues we had when we were trying to put this presentation together was, do we want to lock down every crew that's out there picking up trash or mowing or doing whatever every time they find a can of paint thinner laying by the side of the road? No, we really don't. Not necessarily. So you got to really kind of take into consideration some of these other factors. So when you start seeing multiples of those containers, you start seeing them in combination with these other items, that's when we need to exercise some caution. Containers with bi-level liquids that I mentioned, and any kind of containers with electrical tape or duct tape or any other binding wrapped around the containers, on top of the containers, are all things that we'd want to be wary of. Plastic tubing from fish tanks, all kinds of vinyl tubing. They can use bicycle inner tube. We've seen them use garden hose, vacuum hose, radiator hoses, dryer vent hoses, whatever you can imagine these people are using out there to make methamphetamine. And then I mentioned the coffee filters and things like that with unusual stains. The drain openers, those are pretty self-explanatory, but we want to be really careful of that. any real chemical kind of glassware. Occasionally we'll find beakers and flasks and Bunsen burners and condenser columns and all that. If you were to see that kind of stuff, that would tell you you might be dealing with a lab. And then I mentioned the gas cylinders. And the gas cylinders is a big one for me because they present a really significant threat. Not that the rest of the stuff doesn't, because it does, but just the mere fact of that cylinder sitting there, it could rupture and release that anhydrous ammonia to anybody within the vicinity of it. Just some more examples of what we're looking at there, and you can see all of these things are consistent at those lab sites. The drain openers, the acids, plastic funnels, and the red devil eye, mason jars, or as we like to call them in the lab business, reaction vessels. That's the more appropriate term. Mason jar works pretty good though. All of these things we find at labs. That lab waste, there's the matchbooks from a red phosphorus lab. The heat, the gas additive with methanol, we'll see that used to manufacture methamphetamine. All these solvent cans, I mentioned those flammable solvents and told you that typically it's ether from starting fluid and Coleman lantern fuel, but it could be any of those containers or any of those products. And what's really nice about them is even if they don't have the labels, all of these types of products come in the same cans. They come in a square can with a square handle in the gallon variety, or in a quart-sized can like charcoal lighter fluid with a little snap lid. So just finding the cans in quantity might tell you. Pseudoephedrine and all of the plastic bottles and the blister packs. Okay. You have got a serious salt deficiency if that's what you're looking for in your diet, is my guess. And somebody has a tremendous head cold. I've had people, we got that, it was on sale at the Sam's Club. Wow, 5,000 unit doses worth. Excellent. Okay, these are kind of unusual quantities. But all of these products, all of these Kool-Aid jugs and pop bottles and all of that stuff are all things we see used in making methamphetamine. Here's your basic dump site. That's pretty typical of what we see. And even though it just looks like a lot of trash sitting there, that poses a significant health risk. Significant health risk. When this lab is in operation and things are reacting chemically, it is an acute health risk. That phosphine gas I mentioned earlier, that poisonous gas that you can't see, taste, or smell, when that lab's in operation, it's producing somewhere between 600 and 1,000 parts per million of that gas into the atmosphere, into the air you're breathing. A lot of times we'll find the trash all burn up, but that's still evidence of what was going on there when I find those solvent cans. Even though the labels aren't there, when I find aerosol cans with holes punched in them. Whoa, where's ODOT when we need them? That's a big beer accident there. That's a tragedy. All right, you find yourself at a lab site. Please, please, please don't touch anything. And I know that seems ridiculous that I would have to say it. Don't smell anything. A lot of people like to use their olfactory system as a detection tool. That works great if you're getting out of your truck and you can smell ether coming out of the ditch. That's cool. That worked out well for you. But I don't encourage you to start picking up containers and smelling them, trying to pick these odors up. And please don't open anything. Now, as ridiculous as it seems for me to have to say those things, I have been to labs with DEA agents and other cops that are lab certified that should know what they're doing, and they'll open up a mason jar with no respiratory protection and go, "Hey, D-Lo, what is that?" And I'll go, "That's a federal agent, a dumb federal agent with a mason jar in his hand. What do you think? How'd I do?" So I told you I'd make fun of cops too. Don't get nervous. So I think your policy here at ODOT is going to be to contact the supervisor. Is that correct, Mike? I think I'm going over it here in a second. But ultimately, OSP is going to get notified if you guys find a lab site by the side of the road. And they will in turn contact us or DEA, and we'll respond, and we will take care and clean that lab site up. Oh, there's the procedure there. Yeah, please. The best advice I can give you is that if you think you came in contact with lab or lab equipment, stop what you're doing. Get away from it. Stay away from it and stay upwind. You want to be upwind. All right, and don't hover it around it, wanting to, make sure nobody comes and gets it. You could see it from a ways away. You don't want to take any chances. Supervisor then will contact OSP, and in turn they will get a hold of us, and we will respond. And it is a crime scene. Ultimately, dump sites can be hard to prosecute people from unless we find evidence of who they are in the trash or we collect fingerprints, but we would like to try that. So please take that into consideration, that it is a crime scene, and that we are going to try and collect some evidence from it. Here's our contact numbers at BCI, and when this is over, I have business cards here. I'd be more than happy to give everybody and give you my contact information. But if you, for some reason, can't get a hold of a supervisor, it's late at night, or you just have a question. You're out there and you're doing your thing, and you got a question and you're not sure, call us. We'll call you back. We're very good about response and callbacks. So we'll tell you our best guess as to what you're looking at. Yes, my other house is a meth lab. All right. That concludes the presentation in its entirety, and I think what we'd like to do is take a break, and you've been sitting in those chairs now for an hour and a half, is take a break, and we'll come back in, and I want to go through it kind of slide by slide, answer your questions, and then kind of give you some information as if you intend to go back and do the training yourself. So that's kind of where we're going. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you back here in how long, Mike? 5 minutes is what Brad from legal said. He's got his back turned. That'd take like 7 or 8.